The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news of him spread throughout the whole region. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by all. He came to Nazareth, where he had grown up, and went according to his custom into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He stood up to read and was handed a scroll of the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the passage where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord." Rolling up the scroll, he handed it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue looked intently at him. He said to them, "Today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In the play and subsequent movies, The Winslow Boy, one of the main characters in this play, set at the turn of the century of the 1900s, about a boy who is falsely accused of stealing and cashing a postal order and is expelled from the Naval Academy. One of the main characters, believe it or not, is not the Winslow boy himself, but rather his older sister, Kate Winslow. And toward the end of the play, as the verdict in the case of the Winslow boy is about to be read, one of the assistant attorneys representing her brother comes to Kate as he has fallen in love with her. And as he hints, without actually directly doing it, proposes to her marriage, he expresses to her in a very British way that he can hardly find the words to express his regard for her. So he decides and tells her, "I will put it in a letter. I will put it in a letter." Now, hopefully we all like to receive letters. We just finished the Christmas and holiday season, and Christmas cards are a very cherished tradition for many. I know we priests have a tendency to almost give in our Christmas letters a year in review of everything we've done the last year. I had a good friend, his Christmas card one year was 4 pages long, single-spaced. We like receiving and sending letters. And yet, in the scriptures, we also see the giving and receiving of letters. We have in the Old Testament, the prophet Jeremiah sent a couple of letters to the Hebrew people who were in exile in Babylon to give them words of encouragement. His secretary, the prophet Baruch, has a couple of letters that he had written as part of the book of the prophet Baruch. But not just in the Old Testament, we're very familiar with the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament, which he communicates with the communities that he had founded, aspects of the faith, questions perhaps they had asked, or issues they were facing that have become the foundations of our faith as Christian people. We have other letters such as the letters of John, the letters of Peter, the letter of Jude. Even the early church, such saints as Ignatius of Antioch in the late 1st and early 2nd century. All we know of him and of the theology that he wrote that continues to influence us today is in a series of 7 letters he wrote while en route to Rome to be fed to the lions. So common was it in the early church that many literary scholars see the epistle as a distinctively Christian form of literature, because so much of our faith was communicated in letters. And in many of the great saints, we see letters that had been sent by them and have been preserved for us now to read and see their expression of faith. But not only that, we have in our gospel today the beginning of the gospel according to Luke. And how does it begin? It begins in the form of a letter. The entire gospel is nothing less than a letter sent to a friend, the most excellent Theophilus. And the Gospel of Luke has its sequel in the Acts of the Apostles. And one clue is, Luke says, "In my first account, most excellent Theophilus," speaking of the gospel he wrote for him. Some speculate that Theophilus was a wealthy patron who sponsored Luke in the writing of his gospel, and his cover letter, his introductory letter, remained and worked its way into the text. But be that as it may, the Gospel of Luke is nothing more than a letter to a friend, in which Luke, after painstakingly researching and reflecting upon the mystery of Jesus, writes it down and sends it to a friend. And he does it in the form of a letter. It's perhaps something for all of us to consider in this day and age. If you were to look back perhaps at the time of the Winslow boy, the early 1900s, and you look at letters that had been sent, perhaps some of you have relatives from back then who have written letters that have been preserved. Or you look at the letters written by leaders, whether local or national, and you see the eloquence in the writing. You look at letters written by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, or by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, the eloquence in the art of writing a letter. An art that I think has been lost the more technological we have become. We like receiving letters, but more often than not, perhaps nowadays we receive emails. And one thing we notice in emails is frequent misspellings, punctuation's wrong, capitalizations not included, because emails are often done so quickly. And of course, in the age of texting, we have whole conversations in which we very rapidly type in the text. And we don't communicate by words anymore. We now communicate by abbreviations and initials. LOL, little old lady. WTF, where's the fire? You got nervous there for a minute, I know. And the literary art of letter writing has been lost in many, many ways. And yet still, the letter is intriguing. What is one very popular part of any newspaper? The letters to the editor. I know we priests are not stranger to receiving letters from parishioners. Usually they are quite terse. And usually we receive them when they complain. And I have to tell you folks, in previous parishes, I've always been impressed with sometimes how vile and visceral some of these letters of complaint can be, and the people still put their names on it. I had another priest friend who had a letter written to him, and he actually read it to me, and he was kind of crestfallen because he was newly ordained, welcome to the priesthood. And as I listened to it, I said, let me stop you for a minute. I couldn't help thinking, I love history, and I can't help thinking that if this were the time of President Andrew Jackson, considering what this person is putting in the letter, you could probably call that person out for a duel. And considering their age, you'd probably win. But every now and again, we will receive a letter from someone who is truly appreciative of the work that we do, a card that thanks us, or a card that expresses a reflection that perhaps a homily provoked in them, or gratitude for a visit to a sick person, or even just a friendly glance as we exited the church at the end of Mass. And the eloquence with which they write about their faith, or about their experience of the church, or their experience of people within the parish, we see that the art of letter writing has not been lost. And it means so much more than an email or a text or even a passing comment. They put it in a letter. And it occurs to me, as we are just a couple of weeks away from the season of Lent and we are continuing in a year of mercy, wouldn't it be interesting to have as a resolution during the season of Lent and beyond that perhaps we think of people who have influenced our faith, who have influenced our growth in faith, and we write them a letter. Not an email, not a text. We write them a letter. As this is a year of mercy, in which all of us are called to mercifully seek out those who are lost. How often have I heard people tell me, well, Father, my children don't go to Mass anymore. My grandchildren don't go to Mass. And you want to express to them just how much your faith means to you that you tried to pass on to them. You know you can't have a conversation with them because they'll more than likely interrupt you and then you'll interrupt them and it never goes anywhere good. So put it in a letter in which you can't be interrupted and in which through thoughtful reflection you can very eloquently express how important this faith is that you wanted to pass on to them. As this is a year of mercy, perhaps a resolution during this season of Lent in which everything we do is done with a little bit more intensity, we could perhaps resolve to reflect, is there anyone we need to forgive? Is there anyone from which we need to ask forgiveness? We know how hard it is to express sorrow and perhaps forgiveness face to face. So let us resolve perhaps in Lent to put it in a letter. And we may find ways in which we can express an eloquence that we can't verbally in the presence of someone who may yet interrupt us, and then we will interrupt them, and it will never go anywhere good. But we have an example in a distinctively Christian form of literature, the letter, which has been lost in our technological world that we are so enmeshed in today. But let us remember our heritage as Christians, as Catholics, in letter writing. From the apostles to the evangelists of today's gospel, to the early Christian fathers of the church. Let us resolve, perhaps in the next year, in this year of mercy, that we will get back to the art and the Christian practice of writing letters, in expressing our faith, in offering and asking for forgiveness, in calling back the lost. Let's put it in a letter.